Sometimes when you buy a new pot of paint, you just need a kit to try it out on. So that's why I picked up this relatively inexpensive model, which I'm going to use to try out some new paint. Hello everyone, I'm Matt, this is Model Minutes, and join me on the workbench today as I build and review the PM Model C-45 Expeditor in 1/72 scale. I have already done a full unboxing on this particular kit, so for a deeper dive inside the box to take a look at the instructions, the sprues and the decals, check out that dedicated video. In this one I'm going to be building the kit and seeing what it's like, doing a few extra bits and pieces, but primarily trying out a new kind of metallic paint. It might not be a new product, but it's certainly new to me. I'll put a list of the products I used on the screen now to give you an idea of the kind of things to go and get if you fancy replicating this kit for yourself. And without any further ado, let's get into it. As normal, I'll cut the parts away from the sprue using my cutters and sand down any rough areas using a sanding stick. This is a slightly older and cruder tooling, so there is some flash present which will need to be cleaned up. Tamiya extra thin cement will be my glue of choice, and my first step was to assemble the inner cockpit components. This kit does feature a few simple details inside of here. In particular, it has some bulkheads, some chairs, and also control columns. These were carefully installed in the correct places. And it is worth noting that the rear bulkhead actually sits just inside of the little lip and not on top of it. If you glue it on top, it won't actually fit inside of the aircraft. With the cockpit internals now completed, I actually am thinking about motorising this kit. I've purchased some of these 6mm by 12mm 3V micro motors, which I think will do the job. I've only motorised one other model on my channel so far, so it is going to be interesting to see how this goes. The first thing I did was to drill a 6mm hole in the rear of the engine component. I'm not going to go all the way through the plastic, just deep enough to make a mounting point for the motor, and far enough in so the shaft will extend through the engine. When that was done, I glued the motor into place, being super careful with the glue so I don't jam up the motor, and also making sure that it protrudes far enough through so there is something for the propeller to glue onto on the shaft. Inside of the lower wing half, I need to glue in a clear landing light. If I don't do it at this step, I'll probably forget. And now I can try and install the motor, but as you can see, the landing gear bay actually is in the way. It's not going to be a problem though. I'm just going to cut a hole in here, and this hole won't be visible in the finished build because I'm going to be displaying the landing gear raised as if it's flying. With that done, I now test the fit, and it seems like I'll be able to get it in the right place. The wings mount into the side of the fuselage using these tabs. I decided to cut the centre of the tab out because I'll use that as a channel to run the wires into the fuselage. And then, with that done, I glued the upper wing half onto the lower wing half, making sure to run these wires through that slot. I would repeat this process for the other wing as well. Moving on to the propeller, I cut the moulded shaft to a more realistic length. I then carefully drilled out a 0.7mm hole in the rear of the propeller hub. This means that with a little careful application of glue, I can position it onto the shaft of the motor. I did have to take care here to try and avoid the propeller being off-center and wobbling, so I did this by eye just to try and get it as central as possible. I do have to be careful now though, to not knock the propellers off, as they do have such a small contact area with the motor. As mentioned, I'm going to display the landing gear raised on this kit. Now technically the kit does have a picture of the aircraft with the landing gear raised, but there isn't really parts included to display the landing gear raised unless you modify them. So the first things I did was to glue the landing gear bay covers together, and whilst that was drying I then cut the wheels more or less in half. I then removed the tabs from the landing gear bay covers and then glued the wheel and the covers into the landing gear bay, trying to replicate how it would look if the landing gear was raised. With that done, I now have pretty much the majority of the aircraft nearly complete. So it's time to move on to a bit of painting. I'm going to paint the interior surfaces with this SMS British Interior. This lacquer based paint was loaded into my airbrush and then sprayed over all the internal areas. It dries really quickly, which means I can move on to the next step, which is to use some black paint to pick out the control columns. Because this kit doesn't come with any pilot figures, I've been into my stash box and found a couple that may be suitable. These have been appropriately painted using my normal techniques, and these were then glued into place as well. I have of course had to modify them in order to make them fit. Before I can install them inside of the fuselage however, I need to add the clear glazing from the inside. The clear glazing is not great and there are some sink marks and little bubbles, but for the sake of this build I think they will do. I did have to cut a little bit of plastic away in a few places just to get them to fit. And with that done, I then carefully glued inside the internal components. Because I want my aircraft to be flying, I need to have some way to mount it. No display stand is included, so what I'm going to use is a 4mm brass tube. Holding together the fuselage halves, I identified a point sort of in the middle of the aircraft where I could drill out a 4mm hole. With that done, I came to join the wings onto the sides of the fuselage, making sure to run the wires through those slots which I cut earlier. This was repeated for both sides of the aircraft, and then before I join the fuselage halves together, I need to solder the wires and add an extra length so that I can run it out of the plane. A quick test just to make sure everything's working, and yeah, I'm pretty happy with that, so let's carry on. I superglued the brass rod into place in the hole I've already drilled in the aircraft. I then thread the wires through the hole and then carefully joined the two fuselage halves together. A little bit of glue would be used to join them, and there is a bit of a seam here, and whilst I did spend a little time sanding the seams down because of the fact that there's so many things now attached to the model, I decided I wouldn't go too far with this step. The seam may be a little bit noticeable in the finished build, but as this is just pretty much a project to try out new things, I'm not too fussed about that. The tail surface can be added onto the rear of the aircraft, making sure to try and get this as level as possible, and then the vertical tail stabilizers were added onto the ends of this tail surface. There are some extra details such as radio masts and things which need to be added, and actually some of them are technically not included in the kit, so I kind of made my own to represent them and added them as needed. On the lower side, the tail wheel gear bay was just covered in with a bit of plastic. On the nose there are these two, I presume are pitot tubes, and they were carefully glued in. I do have to be careful now not to knock these small details off. Turning my attention to the clear parts, I have masked this by hand using some tape cut to shape. It is worth noting that the front windscreen does technically have moulded marks for where the frames would be, but they don't seem to match up with images of the real aircraft, so I pretty much just did my own thing here. Humbrol Clearfix would be used to glue this into place at the front of the aircraft. This is a stringy glue, so I do have to be careful not to make a mess, but it should dry clear and strong. For all the other clear parts on the aircraft, I'm going to use some Vallejo liquid mask to mask these. This was blobbed onto the clear parts and allowed to fill the frames. And now it's time to prime. So I'm going to be priming with this Kcolors black primer. This should form a good base for the metallic paint that I will use a bit later on. A few thin coats of this was needed, and then it was left overnight to fully dry. After this, I'm going to use some Vallejo olive drab, which I've thinned down with a tiny amount of acrylic thinner from Tamiya, just to prevent tip dry. You'll notice that I've already masked some areas of the aircraft that need to remain black, particularly on the leading edges of the flying surfaces. This olive drab was then airbrushed onto the internal sides of the engine nacelles and also the nose. These are going to be anti-glare panels shortly. When that was dry and masked, I'm going to be using this Kcolors light mirror. So this is the paint that I bought recently and wanted to try out to see what it was like. This was airbrushed onto the entire aircraft, and a number of thin coats were built up. I'm actually pretty impressed with the shiny metallic effect this paint gives, and it dried pretty quickly, which meant I could move on to the next step. So with that paint dry, I carefully removed the masking tape from the painted areas. I will leave the masks on the windows until almost the end of the build. And now it's time to put some decals on. So you do actually get two different paint schemes in this kit to pick from, but as you can see, I've gone for the silver version for the Royal Navy. PM Model's decals are okay, they're not great, they're printed to a moderate quality, but unfortunately the registration isn't great. So that just generally means that things are not central, and you'll notice on some of the roundels that they are a bit off centre. I cut the decals that I needed from the sheet and soaked them in some warm water. And if you'd like to get your hands on your own brush water mug, check out my merch store. As normal, I'll be using micro scale set and sol as my setting solutions. First up, micro set in the blue bottle would be painted onto the areas of the kit where the transfers are going. The transfers slid off the backing paper, having been previously soaked and carefully positioned. Further applications of micro sol from the red bottle would be added to soften them into the surface details. And the decal application was actually relatively straightforward. The decals didn't tear, and with repeated applications of the setting solutions, they actually settled into the surface details quite nicely. I didn't experience any silvering, which I think is partially down to that nice smooth metallic surface. The only thing I do wish about these decals was that their registration was a bit better and the printing was perhaps a little finer, but for a representation of markings they seem to do okay. With that step now complete, I thought it a good idea to protect these transfers. I'm going to go over the top with some semi-matte varnish from Kcolors as well. This should pretty much preserve that metallic shine whilst also ensuring that the transfers are sealed in and are not tempted to peel away with age. When that was dry, the black paint makes a reappearance, and I used this to pick out various elements of the aircraft which still needed to be painted, such as the blades of the propeller, the radio thing on the top of the plane, and also the wheels protruding from the bottom of the gear bays. Humbrol 99, which is a lemon yellow, was used to pick out the tips of the propellers to point out where the dangerous spinny bits are. After this, I carefully removed all of the masks from the clear parts. I don't typically use liquid mask on windows as I find it can leave kind of a flaky finish, around the edges of the paintwork, but in this case it wasn't too noticeable and it seems to have done a reasonable job. I am glad, however, that I used tape on the main windscreen because it's helped make the representation of the framework much neater. And now I need something to display this on. So I actually thought it would be a good idea to design my own base for this. I need something that will be heavy enough to support the aircraft without falling over, but also have a mounting point for this 4mm brass tube and something in the bottom where I can hide a battery for the motors. So I designed this 3D printable base, which after printing out I've spray painted black, and you'll be able to find this over on my Patreon if you'd like to download one for yourself. I mounted the brass rod onto this and then painted the brass rod in black. One small extra thing I want to do to this aircraft is add some aerial wires. So I have this Ushi rig that thing fine thread, and it was super glued into the various positions. This was a little fiddly, and I think it does add some extra value to the kit, but in hindsight it's not that noticeable, and perhaps I needed a thicker thread. With that done, I taped a battery onto the wires and hid the battery into the bottom of the base. I would like to get a proper battery holder in the future, so that's a small improvement I'll make. But with that, I'm going to call my build of the PM model C-45 Expeditor complete. And there we have it, that's another build under the belt. So first up, I just want to talk about the fact that I use this as a paint mule, and actually that Kcolors black primer and then the Kcolors light mirror, absolutely lovely. I love this, I love the effect it gives. It may not show up particularly well on the camera, it seems a little bit too shiny perhaps for the white balance of the camera, but in real life it does have quite a realistic metallic look to it, and it's definitely a product I'll be considering using again in the future. Absolutely no problems with this particular paint, good even coverage, and the fact that it dries really quickly. Perhaps the only thing I would say is that it did actually take quite a lot of the paint to get nice even coverage, but I still have enough in the bottle to do a couple more kits. So talking about the kit itself then. As you can probably tell, this is not a particularly recent tooling, despite the fact it does feature recessed panel lines on the external surfaces, and whilst we consider that to be a kind of modern feature in kits, the tooling date for this actually dates from 1989. I think that is quite evident in the fact that there are sink marks, there are bubbles in the clear parts, and there is quite a bit of flash on almost every single part. Also, a lot of the details are overly simplified, and when I actually look at this kit, I realise that there are details that are effectively missing. So something that is missing, for example, is on the side of the engines, there should be some exhaust pipes, and I haven't bothered to scratch build any myself, but this just points in the direction of this being a particularly simplified kit by having certain details removed. I do keep a note of everything that I do inside of my modelling journal. These are books that I've created specifically as helpers for your workbench. So if you'd like to get your hands on some and keep a log of your own builds on your own workbenches, check out the link under the video. But within this book I've been keeping a note. This build took me about 4 or 5 days to complete, but I definitely think that if you didn't do the extra bits and pieces that I did with this kit, you could do this one in a weekend, perhaps even in a day. This is generally a fairly simple kit to complete, seeing as it only consists of 56 parts, and some of those parts I didn't use because they are used for the landing gear bays. And speaking of the landing gear bays, it was relatively straightforward to adapt it to depict the aircraft with the wheels raised. It doesn't look perfect, but it'll do. It is a bit disappointing that it doesn't come with crew figures, but I was able to resolve that problem myself, and the installation of the display stand was fairly simple. Even if it did mean that I had to 3D print and design my own base to hold a battery for it. As I mentioned earlier, there are gaps and seams which may need more attention if you wanted to put a bit more effort into this kit than I did. I didn't bother to address them, partly because I'd already assembled parts of the kit and I was worried that I would damage it and perhaps knock the props off or things like that if I tried to fix them, but also because I was trying to make quick progress to try out the paint. I think one small improvement could be with the registration on the decals. I'd like to see Model upgrade the quality of their transfers to make them look a little more refined. But their application was really good and they actually adhered to the surface of the kit with no problems. So yeah, whilst this kit does have a lot of old features and a lot of shortcomings, I think with a bit of work you can make it look reasonably presentable. To be honest though, this kit isn't particularly expensive. Retailing for £7.99 at the time I was making this video, it's almost like a pocket money kit. So if you wanted something to practice your skills on, or in my case, try out motorisation and also a new kind of paint, this is not a bad choice. If you wanted a more serious or accurate representation of this aircraft though, I think you may have to look at the ICM version in 1/48 scale, as that one is a much more recent tooling. But yeah, I think it's probably time to wrap this one up. This was a fairly fun project. It didn't present too many challenges, and those challenges that did crop up, I think I was able to overcome them. Granted, I could have gone a little bit further with this kit, perhaps addressing those seams and gaps, and maybe adding a little more extra weathering. Whilst this kit is rather crude and simple, and will take a little bit of work to make it look presentable, I could consider getting another version of this kit. In particular, this kit actually comes with a second paint scheme which features a camouflaged aircraft, or if you wanted to, Model actually has loads of different variants as well out there in different paint schemes. But yeah, it's a bit crude, it's a bit simple, but in my case, it was a bit of fun. And with that, I'm going to leave this one here. Let me know down in the comments what you think of my build and my review of this kit. As always, a quick shout out to my Model Club members for the extra support they give the channel. Massive thanks to these guys on screen, and if you'd like to join them, check out the links in the description. There are other ways to help support the channel, and full information is below the video as well. The best way to support this channel for free though is by subscribing with notifications turned on so you never miss a modelling upload. Finally though, last thing to say is a massive thank you to you for watching this one, and I'll see you all on the workbench again next time.